lecture series of this type on the West Coast. We now have a national and somewhat international reputation. People know about us, and when I ask people if they will speak, very rarely do they say no. Usually people say, I'm very honored to come. So I would like to thank, first of all, one of our founders, someone who was there at the very beginning with inspiration, and she continues to inspire us, and that's Sylvia Stewart. The current president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, that's on stage, is someone who used to teach in the class and who is in all ways a partner in making sure that this happens every year, and that's Barbara Lashman. We also have people who are members of the Alliance who work very hard. Board member Barbara Tobin. Laura Lee is also a member of the Michael will be back. And then we have people who have contributed to the series in lots of different ways. And you'll meet Hank Cohen in 2 weeks. Hank's here. He'll be on our panel. Thank you. Do you want to come up or just? And I'll introduce you. The first time Zachary and I met, although we corresponded, and he very quickly, on my request by email for him to come and speak to you, said, well, sure, did I think he had anything useful to contribute, and I almost didn't believe that. After you hear about him, you'll realize why I was nonplussed at his response. Zachary Baker is the Reinhardt family curator of Judaica and Hebraica collections at the Stanford University Libraries. He was previously the head librarian at the Hebrew Institute for Jewish Research in New York. And he's been doing that since 1999. The collection at Stanford has been described, among other ways, as being superb. Some of the things that are in that collection are a 1529 Hebrew grammar from Venice, a 1781 Haggadah, which is the book that Jews who celebrate Passover read, and it's from Amsterdam, and a 1731 volume published in Germany of its engravings showing Jews being marched to the gallows, and it has been described as a how-to book. So you can imagine the antiquities, but there's also a new collection which is very close to my heart, and it is the entire archive of the Jewish congregation in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I hope to talk to Zachary about that because that's very close to my research. He has been granted a life membership in the Association of Jewish Libraries and is a native of Minneapolis. And I'll let him, Minneapolis, and I'll let him, perhaps if he wants to, give you his academic credentials. In any case, I would like for you to warmly welcome Zachary.
No glass.
Okay.
Well, I would have been on time, except that I was early, and I pulled off the road in Petaluma, having only been there once before, and I looked at my watch, and it was 10 after 3, and I said, it's time to get on the way. And it shouldn't take 50 minutes, which is what it took me, but A, I took a wrong turn, because I don't know the area that well, and B, when I finally found the campus, I got to the, first I had to find the main entrance, and then their parking machine was down, so they sent me all the way to the far end of the campus, where they said there's another booth that does this. The guy at that end of campus did a little research and figured out that I was really legit, and gave me a parking. They sent me to the E lot, where there were no spaces. I circled around there for 5 minutes, and I finally decided, well, I have 2 legs, I can walk. So I went to the F lot, and the last thing I remember was, as I left my car, was pulling out the parking sticker and leaving it in front, because I was, could have looked right here, right now, and there it would be, and then they'd give me a ticket. So, well, all's well that ends well, except it hasn't ended, it's barely begun. I just want to, I've never used one of these devices, want to see which thing do I use? Okay, good. Except that, this is what I wanted. How do we get back to the beginning? No, I'm going the wrong direction.
Can we have the keyboard?
Yeah, I want to get back to the beginning of the slide. Sorry about this. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to get to the. I just want to get the slideshow. Okay. Anyway, sorry again about that. The title of this I'll explain in a few minutes, but what I wanted to say about my talk is that I'm going to be dealing today in images and stereotypes and perspectives on the culture and even the everyday lives of Jews in Eastern Europe, primarily Poland, between the 2 world wars and slightly before that time. Why Poland? Anyone here, is this interactive? May I interact with you? All right. I'll ask a population question. About how many Jews are there today in the United States? Anyone have a guess? 6 million. Some say 5.5. Some say more. Some say less. But let's say between 5.5 and 6 million. And what was the Jewish population of Poland, let's say in 1939, on the eve of World War II? More than 3 million, correct. It was the largest it was about 3.3 million Jews, about 10% of the country's population, and it was the largest Jewish population center in Europe at that time. And of the roughly 6 million Jews who perished during World War II, during the Holocaust, over half of them were Polish Jews. So this is a significant number. And when we are talking about the Holocaust, to a significant extent, we're talking about the destruction of the center of the Jewish population of Europe. Now let's see here. Okay. Page down on that. Space. Like that. Okay. Now, this is an image that when I was young, maybe in my first year of college, really impressed itself on me when I saw a film called The Dybbuk. Anyone here seen that film? It was made in Poland in 1937, and as I'll discuss in a minute, it's based on a play by the writer Ansky, Solomon Ansky. But the film, it's a ghost story, in a way. This young woman you see on the left, her name is Leah. Her body on her wedding day has been taken over by the spirit of her predestined groom, to whom she was betrothed before she was born and before he was born by their fathers. And unbeknownst to her father, the young man who was boarding, or not boarding with the family, but visiting the family when he came to town as a student in the yeshiva, was, in fact, his name was Hanan, her predestined groom. And he dies in a sequence of events I won't relate in the film and in the play. And because he has been thwarted in his, unbeknownst to him, in his goal of becoming her groom, his spirit takes possession of her, and this spirit is called a Dybbuk. And so there's an exorcism scene in the film, and you see this in the right-hand picture, the actor playing the rabbi. And as the New York Times, when it reviewed this film in beginning of 1938, didn't quite get it, and took it for the way things really were in Eastern Europe, and so did I when I was that age. But could we say it was just a movie? Now, the picture on the left is a portrait, a painting of the author of the original play on which that movie was based, Ansky. And this man was a multifaceted individual. First of all, he was a political revolutionary. He was involved before World War I with a political party in Tsarist Russia known as the Socialist Revolutionaries. And he was also the author of the text of the political anthem of the Jewish socialist movement called the Bund. And he was an ethnographer, one of the leaders of the first and only teams of Jewish researchers in 1912, 1913, 1914 to the small towns of an area of the Ukraine known as Podolia, and to recover artifacts and folklore and songs and proverbs and so on and so forth of what he and his fellow ethnographers considered to be a a way of life that was on decline and on the verge of disappearance, the traditional way of life that, in fact, he depicted in his play, The Dybbuk. By the way, that portrait, that color portrait, was painted by a very well-known Russian Jewish painter, Leonid Pasternak, whose son won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the late 1950s, Boris Pasternak. His most famous novel, Boris Pasternak, was Dr. Zhivago. You might have seen or heard of that. That was made into a movie and TV series. But Boris Pasternak's father was a painter and knew Ansky. That photograph on the right is of one of the first productions, if not the first production, of The Dybbuk on stage. And it was done by a Hebrew troupe, a theater troupe, in Moscow, known as Habima. Now, Habima, later the troupe migrated to what was then the British Mandate territory of Palestine, and they became the national theater of what is today Israel. And there is still a Habima troupe, very well known in Israel. But back in 1919 or thereabouts, when that picture would have been taken, it was known particularly, there was practically no one in the audience in Moscow who understood a word that the actors were reciting on stage in Hebrew, but they understood the gestures and the scenery, and they probably had some kind of summary of the play, and it was very well known in Moscow for being a theater of the avant-garde. So remember that I had this impression of the play, of the film, as being kind of a medieval ghost story, and yet in its original conception, it was very much in the avant-garde. And let's see if this works. The movie. Back to the movie for a second. One of the things that really appeals to those who view it, and appealed to me when I was 18, 19 years old and saw the film for the first time, are some of the exterior scenes, the outdoor scenes. And they are filmed in a very famous locale on the Vistula River south of Warsaw, a place called Kazimierz, or Kuzmir, which is the Yiddish name of Kazimierz. And you see, for example, a painting of the town. It was a town that was had a very active artists' colony, but it was also a typical Eastern European, Polish, Jewish shtetl, that is to say, a market town with population in the 1930s was about 1/4 Jewish. And on the right-hand side, you see a photograph taken in the marketplace by the well of a couple of Jewish townspeople there who were just part of the landscape. You see that the photograph, the snapshot, it's a kind of a Kodak snapshot, was singed. It belongs to a collection of photographs that was assembled after, well, in the 80s and 1990s from people's houses and private collections in Poland, in contemporary Poland today. Either photographs that were left behind in the houses by their previous Jewish inhabitants, or were simply held in the possession of the owners, the present-day owners, Poles, who lived in these houses. And that explains, in a number of photographs that you'll see in this show, the slideshow, come from that collection. And I believe that the name of the collection that was published in a book is "And I See Their Faces." And I found this snapshot on a website of the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, which reproduced them from a Polish website. And in that film, one of the sites that was filmed was the castle of King Kazimierz the Great, Casimir the Great, king of Poland in the 14th century. And he was also famous in both Polish and Jewish folklore for having supposedly had a consort. Do I need to explain what a consort is? A consort is a mistress, or a girlfriend, or a concubine, or something, anyway, something along those lines. And she was a Jewish woman named Esther, at least that's the legend. And this is a painting which I believe no longer exists, by a Polish Jewish painter representing this Jewish consort of the Polish king, who was also famous in the 14th century for having granted Jews a certain privileged legal status to reside in Poland. Poland, I should explain, was in the Middle Ages a place of refuge for Jews who were being expelled from localities and principalities and dukedoms further west in Europe, especially in Germany. And this is the painter Minkowski's representation of this Queen Esther, or not Queen Esther, but Esther, but the name, of course, echoes the Queen Esther of the Bible, who was the consort of a Persian king in ancient times. I could say a lot more about that painting, but you'll have to catch up with me on that. I'm going to be talking about Minkowski at a conference in Toronto in April after it stops snowing. Okay. So that was kind of the phantasmagorical or fantastical vision of Eastern Europe. And this is another sort of fantastical vision of Eastern Europe, and a surrealistic view of the place, very much popularized. How many of you have seen or reproductions of or actual paintings by Marc Chagall? So he's a familiar painter to you, and this is a painting of his hometown and of a Jewish rag picker or something over the town. I plucked this off of the internet. I'm not sure which museum it comes from, so I don't want to be quoted on that. But this is the image that we have, or an image that we have of Vitebsk, the town that he came from. This is another image we have of Eastern Europe. How many of you have seen this musical or heard it? Most of you. Well, I didn't want to quote the absolute most famous line, so I had to pick another line in the same song. And that is Zero Mostel, who was the first Tevye, the main character of Fiddler on the Roof, in the first Broadway production. Again, plucked off the internet. I could tell you more about Zero Mostel. He was a painter as a sideline, and that kept him busy during the years when he was kept off out of movies because he was blacklisted in the United States in the 1950s. But by 1963-64, when Fiddler was first staged on Broadway, he was back in the good graces and was very memorable in that part. And Tevye, as you probably know, is this Jewish patriarch in a small town in a shtetl in Eastern Europe with... the number of daughters varies depending on which of the original stories by Sholem Aleichem. We'll come to him in a second when you are reading. But let's suffice it to say that he has several daughters, none of whom actually does what he wants of them, though at least he's not displeased by what some of them do in terms of their marriage partners. But his idea was that he and his wife would marry them off to suitable matches, but instead they go off and marry guys that they fall in love with. And this is another image, a folkloristic image of the shtetl. And what's interesting about this picture is that Ansky, whom I mentioned just a few minutes ago, who led this ethnographic expedition in the Ukraine, he brought along his nephew, who was a photographer and a graphic artist, Solomon Yudovin. And this is an etching or an engraving that Yudovin made in the 20s based on his travels in Eastern European shtetls. Okay, let's see. Now, did I skip anything here? I didn't see. So this is another view of the architecture of the shtetl as represented in synagogues that were built. On the left, you see a stone structure in the city of Klezmer, which we saw a moment ago. And on the right, a marvelous example of a wooden synagogue. And there is a whole literature about wooden synagogues, books on the subject. The architecture is absolutely unique to Eastern Europe and to Jews in Eastern Europe. And that's the synagogue of Volta. All of them were destroyed during World War II, all of the wooden synagogues. Vitebsk. Remember that painting that you saw a minute ago of this Jewish rag picker walking over the houses of Vitebsk? Well, this is the main street of Vitebsk as found in a picture postcard just before World War I. And somehow reconciling this image with the painting of Chagall, it's a little difficult. You kind of have to strain and put yourself inside Chagall's head. There's nothing really very fantastical at all about this town. It was actually a city, a sizable city, and a capital of provincial capital in Tsarist Russia. Fiddler on the Roof, I mentioned. The plot of Fiddler on the Roof is based on stories written by this man, Shalom Aleichem, or that was the pen name of a writer named Solomon Rabinowitz. And he was very, very famous in his time. He was sometimes referred to as the Jewish Mark Twain. And he actually met Mark Twain when he came to the United States on a visit in 1906 or 7. And Mark Twain is supposed to have come up to him and said that he is the American Shalom Aleichem. And Shalom Aleichem, it is said of him that you could read his short stories. He wrote short stories and novels. You could read his short stories and reconstruct the life of the Jewish shtetl before World War I. Well, that's kind of the literary shtetl. What it actually was like, I think you have to do more than read a short story or two or three, but I do recommend them to you if you're interested in exploring Jewish life in that period. And aside from the Tevye stories, I particularly recommend the monologues that he wrote, which are called the Railroad Stories. I believe that's the title. They're available in English translation. And here are two of his contemporary Yiddish writers. They're in the canon of Yiddish classics. These are the three writers who are pointed to as the kind of the triad. Shalom Aleichem, Mendele Moishe Sporim, that means Mendele the bookseller, that's another pseudonym. His name was actually Shalom Abramovich. And Isaac Slavish Peretz on the right. Now, I'm going to say something about the Yiddish literature of the period between the two wars in Poland, and I'm going to do it first of all by discussing this photograph, these writers, in this very avant-garde group that didn't last very long. They called themselves the Gang. The Yiddish name for this is Chaliastra, and you see a reproduction of the cover of the one and only collection of poems that they published together in Warsaw right in the early 1920s. And believe it or not, those are actually letters in that upper right, Hebrew letters spelling out the title of their collection. But if you look at these writers, you can kind of, what you see is a capsule story of Jewish life in the first half of the 20th century. On the left, a man named Mendel Elkin. He wasn't really a poet, he was a theater personality, and he came to the United States in the 1930s and became a librarian. I think he also wrote a couple of short plays. He was the librarian of the institute where I was librarian before I came to California, the YIVO Institute in New York. He was 2 librarians before me. I never knew him. He died around 1961 or thereabouts. And so I should mention that I was once on a long-distance bus from Montreal to New York about 25 years ago, and I was sitting next to a woman who had come to Canada, lived in Montreal, from Russia, in the 1970s, and somehow or another, his name came up, Mendel Elkin's name came up in conversation. This was his granddaughter. The next one, on the second writer on the left, is a writer named Peretz Hirschbein. And he was a playwright, came to America, I think in the 20s, and he and his wife wandered the globe. She was a poet, Esther Shubiacher, and wandered the globe and wrote books about their travels. And he also wrote a lovely play which was made into a movie in the 1930s called Green Fields, Grüne Felder. Anyone here see that? Really lovely pastoral film set in the countryside, a love story, and it was filmed in the potato fields of Long Island in the 1930s. The third writer, kind of peering over all of the others, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, one of the most famous Hebrew poets of the 20th century. Uri Tzvi Greenberg, though, at this time, was still writing in Yiddish. But by the mid-1920s, he was in Palestine and had become a fanatic adherent of the revisionist Zionist movement led by a man named Jabotinsky. Very, very militant, right-wing, very dynamic, and very different from the man with the head of hair right beneath him, Peretz Markish, who was a fervent communist. And if Greenberg went to Palestine and chose the Zionist route in the 1920s, Markish, who had fled from the pogroms of the Ukraine in the 1918-1919 period, he was living in Kiev in the Ukraine at that time during the civil war between the Bolsheviks and other forces in Russia. He went back to the Soviet Union in the 1920s, was a very successful writer there, until 1948, when he was arrested, and in 1952 he was executed in one of the purges of, this particular purge was aimed at Jewish writers in the Soviet Union. And then this man, pensive eyes, looking kind of off in the distance, Melech Ravitch, that wasn't his real name. His real name was Zachary Berbner. And he too left Poland, though in the 1920s and early 30s, he was, I believe, the secretary of the Yiddish Writers Club, and he wrote a marvelous series of 4 volumes of vignettes of some of the writers, many of the writers whom he knew, and not only writers, other Jewish cultural figures including my painter, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago, Minkowski. He ended up in Montreal in the 1940s and lived there until he passed away in the 1970s. And on the far right is a man with a very familiar last name, but maybe not quite as familiar first and middle name, Israel Joshua Singer, I.J. Singer, very, very famous novelist in his time, but his kid brother surpassed him in fame after I.J. Singer died in the 1940s. He was in New York. He brought his younger brother, Isaac Bashevis Singer, over from Poland in the mid-1930s. And much could be said about Isaac Bashevis Singer other than the fact that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1978, the only Yiddish writer ever to win a Nobel Prize, although he wasn't the only Yiddish-speaking writer to win a Nobel Prize. Saul Bellow spoke Yiddish, won the Nobel Prize. And Agnon, the Hebrew writer who won the Nobel Prize in 1966 for literature, also spoke Yiddish. But he was the only one who won it for writing in Yiddish. And his books are also a very interesting guide to Jewish culture, Yiddish culture, and much of it rather spooky in Poland. I titled my lecture, Life is with People, because that, I cribbed it from one of the most famous studies ever written on the shtetl, the Jewish small town in Eastern Europe. And the authors of this study, Mark Zborowski and Elizabeth Herzog, they carried out the study after World War II, at a time, and what you see in that quote, that, as they wrote, the shtetl no longer existed. It had been destroyed as a result of the events of the Holocaust. And how does an anthropologist, this is an anthropological study, how does an anthropologist do field work among the natives, if that's what you want to call the people who they interviewed? Well, they couldn't go to the field, so they had to interview people who had been born there and who had left it behind, as you see now scattered all over the world. And it's a little bit different to construct an anthropological study of people who have left the place that is being studied, a place that no longer actually is in existence. But this is, if I mention the literary view, the fantastical view, the folkloric view, this is the ethnographic view of the shtetl, scholarly view of it in the early 1950s. I might mention that Mark Zborowski was a communist himself and was implicated, supposedly implicated, though they never got him on this, on the murder of, I think it was Leon Trotsky's son or something like that. And however, he ended his days happily ever after in San Francisco. Another very familiar view of the shtetl of Polish Jews. I brought this book along with me, and you see this picture, cover picture of this photo album up in the left-hand corner, and that picture was taken by a photographer named Roman Vishniak. Any of you seen any of his photographs? Vishniak was actually, by trade and by profession, one of the inventors of a version of photography known as microphotography, used especially by biologists. But in the late 1930s, he wasn't living in Eastern Europe, he was living in Germany actually. He traveled to Poland and Czechoslovakia and took photographs, many of them in these small towns, but also in the large cities. And that is taken up in the upper left, as the picture on the right is too, in what's known as a cheder, a Jewish elementary school, a traditional elementary school where boys would be taught Bible commentaries and eventually the Talmud. And the photographer who took the picture on the left was a man named Alter Katzizna, another playwright and photographer, studio photographer. He would send his photographs over to a Yiddish newspaper in New York called The Forward, and every Sunday they would publish, or many Sundays, they would publish them in an illustrated supplement. And Katzizna, you'll see in a few minutes, or in a minute or two, some of his photographs were recently published in a volume, and they're really quite remarkable. But I would call that Katzizna, and especially Vishniak, and Abraham Joshua Heschel, the famous Jewish theologian, who wrote about this, the elegiac view, the almost the romantic view of Eastern European Jewish culture. Heschel was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, which trains rabbis for the movement known as Conservative Judaism. And in 1945, he gave a lecture in Yiddish, which was entitled, "The Earth is the Lord's." And it was translated into English and published as the introduction in 1946 or 47, I forget exactly, when Polish, 47, when Polish Jews came out. It said that when he gave this lecture in Yiddish in 1945, at the end of it, the audience spontaneously stood up and recited the Kaddish, the Jewish memorial prayer for the dead. And in his lecture, that quote up there is an attempt on his part to revise the image, this kind of backward, mystical, spooky image of Polish Jewry, and put it on a plane with the most glorious chapters in Jewish history. Safed, which was the city where Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah were studied in the 16th century. Worms in Germany, which was one of the oldest and most famous centers of rabbinic scholarship in the early Middle Ages. Cordova in Spain, where Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, was born. And Pumbedita in Babylonia, in what today is Iraq, where the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, the academies where the Talmud was written. And for Heschel, Poland deserved to be placed on the same plane as these locations. Poland, the very name of it, in Hebrew and in Yiddish, there's a legend that when the Jews were expelled from Germany in the Middle Ages, and they came to this place, they said, "This is where we will rest. Poilin, this is where we will rest." It's actually, if you are familiar with the story of Brigham Young, somewhat similar to, this is the place where Brigham Young and the Mormon migrants come to the valley of the Great Salt Lake, and they see that vast fertile plain before them. And that is somewhat an analogy to what the medieval Jews coming to Poland are supposed to have uttered. And that's a typical view of a stream in a Polish shtetl, not the most appealing place to go wash your clothes. I'm going to skip over the maps because I see the time is running along, but this is just to give you an idea of pre-World War I, where Poland as an independent entity does not exist, but is in fact partitioned between Germany, Russia, and Austria. And today's Europe, where there's a Poland that's in a slightly different place. I'll go back, well, I probably won't go back to that, to the Poland of the period between the two world wars. This is another image that we have of Eastern Europe, an image of suffering. And I'm not talking about suffering during the Holocaust per se, rather suffering, pogroms, riots, victimization, especially in the period from 1880 through World War I and thereafter. And this is a postcard view, a postcard reproduction of a painting by Samuel Hirschenberg, who was a Polish-Jewish painter of that period before World War I. And these are Jews going into exile. This is a view of a map of Poland in the interwar period, and it was, it extended a bit further east than it does today. And the western boundary, in other words, parts of what today are Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine were in Poland then, and also parts of what were then in Germany are today in Poland, West Prussia, Silesia, parts of East Prussia. Much of that actually belongs to the Russian Republic today, of all things. And this is just a snapshot of the Jewish population figures in Europe right before World War II. And you see that the USSR and Poland account for over 6.25 million Jews. And after the war, look at how much smaller those circles have grown. When my title, as you heard, is curator. But what am I really by profession? I'm a librarian. And as a librarian, I started out working in the mid-1970s at the Evo Institute in New York. And at that time, an exhibit of some of the photographs in the Evo photo archives was put on at the Jewish Museum in New York. And a book was published by that name of the exhibit, Image Before My Eyes, and eventually a documentary film was made. Any of you seen that documentary or have that book? By the way, I believe that photograph down on the bottom is a photograph taken by Roman Vishniak in the Jewish quarter of Warsaw in the late 1930s. And if we had all of these mythical views of Poland before that I've shown you up to now, the intention of the curators of the exhibit, Lucian Dobroszycki and Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblick, was to demystify Poland and to try to impress upon people that it was a place where Jewish kids in the 1920s and 30s belonged to sports clubs, were involved in politics, not just kids obviously, involved in politics, went skiing, marched in May Day parades, sold thimbles in the marketplace and whatnot, and of course celebrated weddings and so on. And I wanted to just show you a few photographs, not necessarily from that book, that are an attempt to give you a visual image that clashes a little bit from those first pictures you saw of the young bride who's been possessed by a demon and is about to have the demon exorcised, the phantasmagorical European Jewish life. And instead what we see here are scenes from Jewish neighborhoods, in this case in Warsaw, in the city of Lublin, street scene, a bootmaker. You see the representation there. Krakow on the left, Kutno, not a very famous city or a very large city in the 1930s. If you went through your grandparents' or great-grandparents' or parents' photo albums and you looked at some of the pictures that they had from this period, would they have been dressed much differently? I don't think so. I mean, I've seen pictures from my mother's youth in that 1930s, and she wore dresses just like those women, especially on the right. And some Polish Jews even drove cars. They had telephones too, not cell phones though. But I have an acquaintance whose father lived in a small town, ran a small business in a small town, a delivery business in a small town in Poland before World War II. And this fellow, his name was Mark, told me that every year his father would buy a new pickup truck, a new Chevy pickup truck for his business in the 1930s. Must have been doing pretty well back then, but that gives you an idea of a reality of Poland in that period. Now, Mark's father, when he came to America as a refugee from the Holocaust after World War II, actually ended up in a much more stereotypical line of work. He sold clothes in a shop on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City. So he drove a truck in Poland and he was selling clothes in New York City afterwards. I mentioned politics, and the gamut ran from far left to far right in the Jewish communities of Poland in this period. And these are actually not quite far left or far right. On the left, a group of young Zionist youth. And on the right, a group of socialist, Bundist youth. And I like to show examples of propaganda, you might call it, from this period, teens, 20s, and 30s. And these are actually taken from the archives of the Eagle Institute in New York. On the left, a political poster from the period about 1918 in Russia. And remember Udovin, whom I mentioned, Ansky's nephew, who did that snowbound scene of a small town? Well, he did this poster for the Volkspartei, a culturally Yiddishist-oriented political party that didn't go much anywhere, but produced beautiful posters. And from the period of World War I, you see this, I guess that's a shop put, right? And then all of these gymnastics going on. The effort to improve one's mind and one's body, self-improvement in that period was very much in evidence. And here, for example, is a photograph of a soccer team, a Jewish soccer team in Warsaw, probably in the 30s. And an outing by a group of young socialists who were swimming and voting. That may be the Vistula, and that up on the very top, I believe that could very well be the ruined castle that I showed you a little earlier in Kazimierz. Another couple of examples of the graphic art of the period. Even if you can't read Yiddish, can you figure out what is going on in the left hand or in the right hand poster? Any guesses on the left? Keeping the flies away. Flies are not sanitary. And on the right, any guesses what's going on there? Get rid of that bottle and do it yourself, Mom. And this is a campaign for breastfeeding on the part of a public health organization. It was based in Berlin in the 20s. Got most of its funding from overseas, from the United States, the American Joint Distribution Committee, and distributed these posters and campaigns in Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe during this period. And this is the Polish equivalent of that organization. That's an organization called TOZ, and they ran these camps, summer camps, out in the countryside, and where the air was fresher and germs were harder to catch. And these are a couple of more or less random examples. It's true, we wouldn't call this state of the art, but these were doctors' offices in one case in Grodno in Poland at the time, and Kaunas in Lithuania, and that is I would guess a female, well, she's a female pediatrician examining the baby on the right, and gives you a little bit of a perspective on the entry of Jews even in the impoverished circumstances of the Great Depression into the professions such as medicine and nursing. We're getting towards the end of my slideshow, and I wanted to show you a few examples of traditional and not so traditional Jewish scholarship in Eastern Europe. Now, that quotation we heard by Heschel, comparing in this book and in that slide, comparing Poland to Babylonia, where the Talmud was written, Cordoba, where Maimonides lived, and so on and so forth. He was thinking of the Poland that produced this famous yeshiva, this Academy of Rabbinic Study in Lublin. This yeshiva is actually a fairly new yeshiva. It was founded in 1930. It was known as the Yeshiva of the Sages of Lublin. Lublin is a city about 100 miles south of Warsaw, middle-sized city, a very, very picturesque place. And it was called Yeshiva Chochmei Lublin, the Sages of Lublin. And the building, you can still see the building. It was not destroyed during World War II. After World War II, it became a medical clinic, although I gather that it no longer is serving in that capacity. Now, probably the most famous city of Jewish learning in Eastern Europe is Vilna. Today it's Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, but in the period of the 20s and 30s it was held by Poland. And this was, I'm a librarian and I'm partial to views of libraries, this was the most famous and probably greatest Jewish library in Vilna, certainly, and maybe in Eastern Europe, the Strashun Library, which was the library of the Jewish community in Vilna. And you would see a mix of traditional and not so traditional, the fellow on the right in the glasses, for example, not so traditional readers in that library. I could give a whole lecture on what happened to the books in the Strashun Library. Suffice it to say, in a nutshell, that during the occupation in 1941 to 43 of Vilna, the Nazi occupation, the library was confiscated and transported by an organization led by the Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg, transported to Germany, to Frankfurt. This was part of a large-scale campaign that was undertaken by the Nazis to assemble under their jurisdiction and build the greatest Jewish library and museum, or museums of them all, but one that would be museum and library that would tell a very different story from what the creators, the original creators of libraries like this Russian library were trying to tell. But the story they would be telling today would be about what they had done then. How would they have told that story? Would they have told that story? But meanwhile, they would have known all of these books. Well, the Strashun Library's books were discovered after World War II outside of Frankfurt by the American Army, and most of those that were survived ended up in New York City in the Eagle Institute, amazingly enough. And that is a picture of the reading room in the Eagle Institute in Vilna before World War II. Again, the saga of what happened to the Institute in the occupation, very, very interesting story. It was outside of the confines of the Vilna ghetto and was used, the building was used as a transport point for all of the looting that was going on of Jewish cultural treasures, and not only Jewish cultural treasures, material that Rosenberg was siphoning to his library and museum in Germany. I think I'm coming up on my very last picture. I just think it's a pretty picture. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the snapshots that was in the collection, and I see their faces. Snapshots of Polish Jews, kind of stray pictures that were not assembled except much later on by design. But I like classical music, and I like the piano, and I think this must have been a wonderful pianist. I'd like to believe that, at any rate. And this gives you a glance at how connected Eastern European Jews were, believe it or not, to the wider world of European culture in that time. And for every novel, let's say, or short story written by Shalom Aleichem or Peretz, there was one being translated into Yiddish or Hebrew, from French, from Russian, from Polish, from German, from English. And some of the most popular writers in Yiddish were actually Americans or Russians or Poles. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this was not a world that was cut off from the rest of the world, the civilization of Eastern European Jews. It was very much part of the world that surrounded it. I see that I officially have come to the point where you ask questions. So, are there any questions or comments regarding anything I've said? Yes.
I had a question, a little bit off topic. Was Sergei Eisenstein, was he Jewish? And if so, how was he received by his contemporaries?
Was Eisenstein, the filmmaker, Jewish? You know, I've heard conflicting reports on that. I believe that he would have been no more than part Jewish, but I don't know for sure. You can look it up, though, in the Encyclopedia Judaica. That's the librarian's answer. If he's in there, then he probably was. But I'll launch into a vignette since you mentioned that. One of the most famous films of Eisenstein is called The Battleship Potemkin. Anyone here seen that? There's a very, very, very famous scene on the steps in Odessa where a baby carriage is kind of bumping down the steps during a political demonstration. Well, the cinematographer who filmed that sequence, about a year earlier, filmed a very similar but less menacing sequence on the Odessa steps for a silent Yiddish movie called Jewish Luck, Yiddish Glitten. And it was the same cinematographer, and if you're familiar with silent films, you know that they don't have subtitles, they have what are called intertitles. In other words, you see the motion on the camera, and then cut, and you see a title, and then dialogue or a caption or something. The titles to that Yiddish Glitten were written by Isaac Babel, a Russian language Jewish writer, very, very famous in his time, and actually still very famous. And what connects Eisenstein is the fact that the same cinematographer worked on this film, and he shot that sequence in the same place. He must have had a thing about the steps. And I mean the steps, the Odessa steps, not the broad steppes of Russia where the Cossack hordes were tramping their horses. Yes.
Just to make a connection for next week's lecture, which is about Klezmer music, you had a nice connection with this wonderful pianist, and the probability that, given she was playing piano, she would have been playing drums with water, European.
Bach, Mozart, Beethoven.
Yeah. The role of Klezmer music in Polish culture.
Have you all heard some Klezmer music? I can't hum.
They haven't, they go next week.
Okay. Klezmer music is the music of mainly of Jewish wedding bands and entertainment for weddings and festivals, but mainly weddings. In traditional Jewish society, before they started playing Mozart and Bach and so on and so forth, it was really, the Klezmer music was really the main outlet, musical outlet, that is, instrumental musical outlet for Jewish performers. And there was an entire subculture of musicians. They weren't considered particularly respectable in Jewish society until they were discovered in the 1980s. But they, of course, at any wedding, you would hear them performing. And in fact, in that film, The Dybbuk, I believe that there is a scene with some, what we would call klezmer music. The word klezmer means musician. It's a Hebrew origin word that's used in Yiddish. And it refers to a particular type of musician. You wouldn't call, even in traditional Yiddish culture, you wouldn't call a performer in the Warsaw Philharmonic a klezmer. But it's the music of the wedding and of the carnival. And of course, the other variety of serious music you would hear in Jewish society is cantorial music. That was respectable, although many cantors themselves were not. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you tell us what the contemporary state of Jews in Poland is, the population, and where if there are any central places where they are living, and what perhaps a little bit of the cultural condition of this moment?
The condition of Jews in Poland today. Numbers, the statistics are not precise. Some have as few as 10,000 or fewer, others a little bit more. As you saw in that briefly in that population statistic in that map, after World War II, well, on the territory of Poland, when Poland was liberated, there may have been no more than 50,000 Jews on the territory of the 3.2 or 3.3 million before the war. About 200,000 or 300,000 Jews had, however, succeeded in finding refuge further east in Soviet Russia during the war. Many of them fought in the Soviet army and came back to Poland, most of them fairly briefly, right after World War II. But there was a brief moment, a year or so, when there may have been as many as 250,000 Jews in Poland in the mid-1946 until events, pogroms and other events, political events, made it much more enticing for them to move west, and eventually most of those Polish Jews who fled came to either Israel or the U.S., Canada, or Australia. In the period under communism, there was a steady attrition of Jewish population, actually specific moments 56, 68, connected to political developments in the country, when the community, the Polish Jewish community, kept getting smaller. And by the time the end of communism came in 1989, there was actually a book that came out shortly before that called The Last Jews of Poland. And it's a photo album. And the pictures were actually run in the National Geographic circa 1985. And the impression was all that was left of Polish Jewry today in 1985 were a bunch of elderly people living in old age homes, and it was all going to end. And, yes, to a large extent, it has ended. But what is interesting is that groups of younger Jews, not many, but there are some, rediscovered after communism their roots. It was not easy to be openly involved with the Jewish community under communism. And they started publishing magazines. They revitalized, there aren't many synagogues, but they revitalized, for example, in Warsaw, the Nożyk synagogue, which is the main synagogue in Warsaw. I don't know the numbers. There are probably no more than 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 Jews in Warsaw today. And there are sprinklings of Jewish communities, none of them very large, elsewhere in the country. And the Poles, meanwhile, the question about Klezmer music, they've discovered Klezmer music, and every year in Krakow, there is this mammoth Jewish cultural festival where performers are brought in from all over, and the streets of the old Jewish quarter of Krakow, which is a beautiful, picturesque quarter, are crammed mainly with Polish, not Jewish, young people dancing and singing and celebrating. Is that Jewish culture? It's hard to say, but it's bless you. It is. I mean, when the Poles are doing the dancing, is that Jewish culture? That's kind of my question. I don't have an answer for that. That'll be on the test, though. But that's a very, very rough nutshell of what Polish Jewish life is like today. Oh, and there's a museum of Polish Jewish history and culture that is being built in Warsaw in the old ghetto. Yeah.
Probably another lecture that's possible would be the contributions of Polish Jewish immigrants to the United States. How many people here believe or know that they have Polish Jewish immigrants in their family's genealogy? There are a lot of people.
Depending on how you define Poland in terms of geography, probably 80 or more % of the Jews alive in the world today have some descent of Polish Jewry. Now, the Russian Jewish historians consider much of it Russia, and the Polish Jewish historians consider most of it to be Poland, because until the late 18th century, Russia really did not have a Jewish population, but rather, as it expanded westward and took over Polish territories. By the way, the Lithuanians would claim it's all Lithuanians. It has to do with Galatians too. Anyway, but Eastern European Jewry, which was once defined as the Jews of Poland and Lithuania, broadly defined, their descendants, even after the Holocaust, for all it brought, are the Jews of most of the Jews of the world today. And most of being Jews in the United States. Yes?
I just had a question. You mentioned several times about the speckled, the villages. Were these just in Eastern Europe? Were they the Jews that
what is a shtetl? Where is it? Is it characteristically Eastern European? Yes. By and large, further west, let's say Germany, those Jews who lived in towns, by and large, they're small minorities in towns. They may have carried on occupations that were common to what Jews carried on and did in Eastern Europe. But really, what we're talking about is the market towns of the commercial centers, very small many of them, of Eastern Europe. Towns that, by and large, were established by local nobility. The villages, the agricultural towns, the agricultural settlements were, by and large, where peasants lived, the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Russians, though there were Jews in the villages as well, not in large numbers, there were large proportions, but the shtetl was the place where the villagers, the peasants, came and, on the one hand, sold their produce or their lumber, and on the other hand, bought the goods that the merchants had to offer that were coming either from towns themselves or from the world at large. They were, and so in effect, the Jews of Poland were the, they were a middleman group in Poland, but they were also the middle class before the Industrial Revolution arrived. The middle class, because Poland, if you know your French history, the estates, the nobility, the clergy, and what was the third estate? But it was everyone else. In Poland, in effect, the Jews were an estate of the sanctioned by the crown and by the nobility, and a legally constituted estate in pre-modern. And this was not the case in further west. Yes?
You mentioned Poland as an area where most of the Jews that were pushed out of Western Europe settled.
Mm-hmm.
As the tale of the settlement for the Russian Empire, was that similar in geographical area, or was that like Ukraine?
If I could navigate back somehow to that map of the Pale, I don't know if I can, but is there a doctor in the house? I don't know how to scroll down here. Yeah.
I can't see it, so.
Keep going a little further. Okay. Yeah. Now we're getting, 23. Okay. What you see there is a map of the Pale settlement, which was lifted from the Jewish Encyclopedia published about 100 years ago. And it's, if you can see, although you may not see the names, these are provinces, guberni in Russian, of the Russian Empire, and where Jews were allowed to live, permitted to live. By and large, there were not Jews living, not in any large numbers at any rate, further east of these provinces. And the darker the shading is, the higher proportion of the overall population is Jewish, and it approaches 20% in some of these provinces. Those provinces belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth until what is called the partitions of Poland in the 18th century. That's why Russia didn't have Jews, because none of what is Pale was in Russia under Russian rule until the late 18th century. So Catherine the Great, having the Empress of Russia, having brought all of these provinces under her rule, Russian rule, declared that these were the provinces, the former Polish provinces, where Jews would be permitted to continue to reside. And that, in a nutshell, is what the Pale settlement was. Of course, by 1900 or so, when this map was made, it had been Russian for more than a century, for 125 years, and so that was what it was certainly considered in political terms, geopolitical terms.
Any more questions?